Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 17 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Minnesota Wild, in which the Sharks have won 3-2 in the shootout. And this is the sort of a game of firsts for the San Jose Sharks, as not only do they get their first shootout win of the season, having lost their prior 3 games attempts at the shootout in this year, but also this is the first time the Sharks have actually had a winning streak this season. Their very few prior wins were always sort of one and done. They'd get the victory and then immediately move back into the losing column. But here in games 16 and now 17, the Sharks finally string together a couple of victories. Not a great sign that it's coming 16 and 17 games into the year, but you do have to start somewhere. On to how this game played out in the first period. The Wild were definitely the better team, and while the Sharks found themselves down just 1-0, it probably could have been an even larger deficit if not for some solid saves from their goaltender. On the single goal that he did let in from Goodrow, this was just terrible defensive coverage in front, or not even in front, just generally in the zone by the San Jose Sharks, who literally send like 3 or 4 people along the boards to cover Kaprizov, leaving Goodrow all alone in front, enough time to make himself a sort of coffee and a sandwich there before actually being able to score on Reimer. So 1-0 Wild after 20 minutes, and in the second period, the Sharks definitely did bring it back, were better in that middle frame, but not enough to actually get a goal. And so at the end of 40 minutes, the Sharks were still trailing by a goal. But just a single goal is not insurmountable. The Sharks got an early third period power play, but instead of managing to convert on that power play like they have done multiple times as of late over these past few games where the Sharks power play has seen noticeable improvements, they instead give up a shorthanded 2-on-0 after Erik Karlsson trips over himself at the blue line, and very, very difficult to save to make there, to say the least. And the Wild now have the 2-0 lead, and this is about 45 or so minutes into this game, and prior to that, the Sharks did not really show much offensively besides their first line, and so it didn't seem as though the Sharks would manage to actually tie this game up. But a couple of unlikely suspects contribute on the scoreboard to make this game 2-2 and eventually head to overtime. Those are Lorentz and Sturm, and you may say, well, Sturm just got his 6th goal of the year. Is he really that unlikely? Well, based on how he has played these past few games and the fact that it's mostly been the Sharks' top 6 actually scoring goals over these last 6 games, it is still somewhat surprising for Sturm to actually get that. And speaking of the Lorentz goal, I actually want to bring up the officiating here tonight. On the rare times I bring up the officiating, it's usually in relation to how the Sharks got, unlucky in terms of refereeing, but I'm actually going to go the other way here tonight. The Sharks may have actually caught a break somewhat with the officiating in tonight's game. There was that Luke Cunnin high stick onto Cale Addison where that one didn't get called, and then on this Lorentz goal in particular, very same player, Addison, gets seemingly a stick or at least like a hand to the face, and there is no call, and this is what allows Lorentz the space and the time to be able to get this goal past Gustafsson, which broke the shutout and maybe even broke his confidence a bit, because of course the Nico Sturm goal that was scored just a couple of minutes later was pretty weak and one that most goaltenders should be able to make the save on. But in the end, the Sharks do have this game tied up at 2. We head to overtime where there are a couple of chances, but one of the things that have really developed these past few years from the 3-on-3 overtime has been just sort of the possession game that many teams like to play. And when it comes to the possession games, when you're in the offensive zone, a lot of teams will choose to exit the offensive zone, regroup in the neutral zone to tire out the opposing team's players, the opposing team's defenders, and then try and sort of make an actual offensive push after that, which kind of ruins the flow of the overtime. I personally like it when it's sort of back and forth, 2-on-1, breakaway the other way, crazy plays like that. And so when it played slow and albeit correctly, it can be a bit more disappointing to watch. And I felt as though there was a lot of that at times in this particular game. Still, a couple of decent chances. Barabanov had a great opportunity to just end the overtime in the last couple of seconds, but in the end, it didn't end up happening, and we went to the shootout. shootout where, like I mentioned earlier, the Sharks have lost their first 3 shootouts, all 3 coming in a row thus far this season. So I didn't have a ton of hope, but the Sharks actually managed to end up winning this one. They get a goal from Barabanov to end it off, and they also get a goal from Nick Bonino. It's crazy to watch Nick Bonino. Obviously, I have not been his biggest fan as of late since the beginning of last season when he first became a San Jose Sharks, but it's kind of crazy to watch him like at even strength. He's like, what is even the offensive zone? I only exist in the defensive zone. And then meanwhile, you put him out as a shooter in the shootout, and suddenly he's got like crazy moves, backhand, forehand, going back and forth, he roofs it top corner, everything like that. And you're like, where is this Nick Bonino during like actual playing time to be able to score goals? But some players are just excelling at that particular part of the game, and maybe Nick Bonino is one of those players. But on to the players to talk about here today. We have Meier, Hertl, and Labanc as the first line, once more leading the way. No surprise here that this line continues to be the best one for the San Jose Sharks. It has the big names, it has the big players, it has the best players, and it is once again the line that was really generating most of the chances for the San Jose Sharks through this game. Timo Meier in particular continues to really be the Sharks' best player, I would say, over these past few games. At a point this season, it was Erik Karlsson for multiple games, but I feel like as of late, Karlsson has slowed down slightly and Meier has really picked up the slack. He had a 5-game goal streak come to an end here tonight as he didn't manage to get a 6th straight, but definitely not for a lack of trying. I believe he actually hit the post. I can't recall if this was late in the third period or in the overtime, but he did hit a post at some point. I think it was in the overtime, and so he came very, very close to getting that 6th straight goal. He's just been really, really good for San Jose as of late, which is obviously very important for the Sharks as a whole, but also important for himself because this is a contract year for Timo Meier, and he's going to try and, do his best as possible to try and get the best possible contract for himself. On the second line, we once again had Barabanov, Couture, and Nieto. There was technically a possibility that someone else would slot in onto the second line in place of Nieto because we saw during last game that Nieto was moved down to the fourth line in favor of Svechnikov. But the fact is that while Labanc was like a pseudo-solution to that first line issue, Nieto is not the pseudo-solution to the second line issue, and there really isn't anybody else on this roster. I mean, we've already seen Kunin do horribly in this role. Bonino obviously is not the player for it. Nico Sturm is a center who you want in the bottom 6. Svechnikov clearly is not going to work. Lindblom would be like the only player who you have sort of a chance of making it work there, but he has shown literally nothing thus far this season to even remotely deserve a spot in the second line, and so the Sharks will continue to roll with Matt Nieto. They will continue to run a pretty ineffective second line, and they will continue to rely on either timely, maybe even somewhat lucky goal scoring from their bottom 6, or just general dominance, hopefully, from their top line if they actually want to score goals and win games. Speaking of the third line, I will say that they were slightly better than they were last game, where they were just completely devoid of any sort of offensive talent. Sturm obviously scores a goal in this one. He also had a pretty close call earlier on in this game where he had a chance to, I believe this was back in the first period, almost had that tap-in goal but just barely missed. And I thought generally the third line wasn't as terrible, but it was definitely still, I would wager, the Sharks' worst line. You could argue maybe the second line was there, but Barabanov had a couple of okay chances, so I would still put the third line right at the bottom. But on to the fourth line, I actually thought the fourth line was decent enough here tonight. They were once again doing what you hope for the fourth line to do. Goal scoring is obviously something that is looked upon quite favorably and is not something you're necessarily going to expect from your fourth line, but they won sort of the battles that they were in. They came on the ice, they played a few minutes. I believe Lindblom had a game low besides Shemek, who got injured, who I'll get to a bit later, but he had a game low, like 7 minutes of ice time, but at the very least in those 7 minutes, he was not playing his defensive zone, relatively invisible still, but a goal for Lorentz is nice, and so a okay game for the fourth line. On to the defensive side of things, like I mentioned just a bit earlier, Shemek actually gets injured right near the beginning of this game, and so the Sharks, for the majority of it, are running with 5 defensemen, and on top of that, they actually only end up playing Megna, surprisingly, for about 12 and a half minutes, so this ends up with extremely inflated ice time for some of these Sharks defensemen. Erik Karlsson ends up with over 34 minutes of ice time, and obviously this game did go to overtime, and he played a good chunk chunk of that overtime, but still 34 minutes is not necessarily the most sustainable amount of ice time that you can give a player like him, and Ferraro ends up with over 27 minutes for himself. He's not necessarily sort of new to seeing this high ice time. He was once paired with Brent Burns, a year ago, a couple of years ago, and he would frequently see some really high ice times in those types of situations. So he's not new to this scenario, and it's not completely introduced out of the blue to him. But Ferraro really hasn't been that great thus far this season, so it was definitely a big test. And I will say that Ferraro did actually pass that one. I thought this was Ferraro one of his best games of the entire season thus far, which is, like I said, not saying much because I really have felt Ferraro has lacked somewhat through these first 16 games. But in game 17, he finally shows up. Maybe this expanded role actually sort of served him well, and it was nice to see him finally look like the Mario Ferraro we honestly weren't even seeing that much from him last year, but a couple of years ago when he first broke out, that was the type of Mario Ferraro we saw here tonight. Another defenseman who I do want to mention positively is actually Matt Benning. He also played a hefty amount of minutes, over 22 minutes here tonight, which, if you had told me prior to the game here, you said, well, Matt Benning's going to get 22 minutes, I would have thought that this was going to be an unmitigated disaster for the Sharks and they'd lose like 10-1 with Matt Benning being a minus 52. But what actually ends up happening is Benning plays it rather well, solid gap control, solid defensive zone play, and really just sort of stuck to the game plan, didn't really give the Minnesota Wild much to do with when he was on the ice, and was also jumping up into the play a bit offensively, not really that much, not necessarily something that you're saying, wow, is he going to be the next Erik Karlsson, but at the very least there was something there, so I thought this was also one of Benning's better games of the entire season. Moving on to the goaltenders, we have, of course, James Reimer, and I mentioned at the end of the Dallas Stars game that while he was half decent in that one, it's not a recipe for success to let in 4 goals in a particular game, and Reimer was significantly better here tonight, only lets in 2 goals, and 2 goals that he had basically no chance on. The second one, like I mentioned, was a shorthanded 2-on-0, which is like the most difficult save to ever make, and then the first one was just horrible defensive zone coverage for the San Jose Sharks that Reimer just is not going to be able to make that save on. But otherwise, there were some really solid saves, and while I will say that the Sharks didn't give the Wild a ton here in this particular game, they did give them some still grade A chances, and Reimer was there to make the save pretty much every single time, besides of course these 2 goals that he did let in. So definitely a much improved game from James Reimer. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Vegas Golden Knights, one of the best teams in the league thus far this season. They only trail the Boston Bruins, I believe, in terms of league-wide points, second place otherwise, leading the Pacific definitely, and the Vegas Golden Knights, of course, the last time the Sharks played against them was last season, where they were kind of the team that eliminated them from playoff contention, the first time the Vegas Golden Knights had missed the playoffs in their franchise history. And so I don't know if they still remember that. It is a different coaching staff and everything like that, but maybe they'll be looking for some sort of revenge, and the Sharks will be looking to try and extend their 2-game winning streak to a 3-game winning streak, but they'll certainly have their work cut out for them. Class dismissed.